Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 1 at Madison Area Technical College on the spinal cord. We will be looking at the anatomy of the spinal cord today. Specifically, we will talk about the meninges that cover the cord. I've just circled kind of the cross-sectional area of the spinal cord, seen because a laminectomy was done of the vertebral column. So they chip away the lamina of the vertebrae so that you can visually see inside the vertebral canal. And what we see here is the spinal cord and rootlets coming off of the spinal cord to then form spinal nerves that pass between vertebrae to reach different regions of the body. So we'll look at the anatomy of the spinal cord, its gray matter, its white matter, and its coverings. So first let's start with an overview of the function of the spinal cord. In combination with spinal nerves, the spinal cord provides communication between the brain and structures in the body, like muscles, glands, the skin. And this communication is occurring in two directions. Motor information comes from the brain and travels down the spinal cord to an appropriate level, depending on what's being innervated, and then out a spinal nerve to the body. Sensory information goes in the opposite direction. Sensory receptors in the body detect stimuli. That information is carried in a sensory neuron located in a spinal nerve, going to the spinal cord, and then that sensory information is transmitted up to the brain. We become aware of the sensations once the information reaches the cerebral cortex. In addition to providing two-way communication between the brain and the body, the spinal cord is also a site of reflexes that happen without input from the brain. So sensory information will come in and motor information will go out in response to a certain kind of stimulus automatically without our conscious control of it. So those are the functions of the spinal cord. Now let's look at the anatomy of the spinal cord. It's a cylinder, shaped like a cylinder, and it's nervous tissue. So all the cells that we've talked about, with the exception of microglia and oligodendrocytes, exist in nervous tissue. That means neurons and astrocytes and Schwann cells. And this cylinder of nervous tissue lies within the vertebral canal and is covered with the meninges. This picture shows the spinal cord all the way from the brainstem down to the sacrum and the coccyx, actually. And there are a couple of vertebrae that have been left in place. T1 is still here, and I believe this is L2 right here. So you can see the cylinder because of nervous tissue, the spinal cord, because the meninges have been cut open. And of course, remember, the meninges consists of three separate layers. So the spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum, and this cylinder of pretty dense nervous tissue ends at about vertebrae lumbar 1, approximately, in between L1 and L2. And then within the meninges, within the vertebral canal, what continues is just a bundle of nerves that have originated from the end of the spinal cord. This bundle of nerves is called the cauda equina because it looks like the tail of a horse to someone. So this picture might be easier to talk about the length of the spinal cord on. The spinal cord begins, of course, at the foramen magnum, and as I mentioned, it ends between L1 and L2. After that, the cauda equina is contained within the vertebral canal. And there are different regions of the spinal cord: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal, but we won't talk about that. And the names of these regions correspond to where the nerves that start in the cord leave the vertebral canal. So notice that thoracic vertebrae number 12 is down here. Yet we call this region of the cord the lumbar region. That's because from the lumbar spinal cord, nerves are formed and they travel inferiorly down to the lumbar vertebrae before they emerge out to become spinal nerves. So there's a little bit of discrepancy between vertebrae regions and spinal cord regions, but what does line up are the names of spinal nerves, like cervical nerves, and the vertebrae, the bone. So cervical nerves, there's 8 pair that emerge between cervical vertebrae. There are 12 pairs of thoracic nerves that leave the cord between thoracic vertebrae. The lumbar spinal nerves consists of 5 pairs that leave the cord and the vertebral canal between the lumbar vertebrae, between 2 lumbar vertebrae. And the same is true for the sacral region. The nerves travel inferiorly and emerge as spinal nerves from the vertebral canal between regions of the sacrum. Another feature of the spinal cord, besides its length and the regions, is that there are enlargements in certain locations. So there's an enlargement at the cervical region and an enlargement at the lumbar region because there's more tissue here to accommodate more nerves that are going to be sent to the limbs, the arms and the legs. The conus medullaris is the very end of the spinal cord. It's a taper. It comes to a point. The spinal cord kind of comes to a point. And that tip or end is called the conus medullaris. And then I've already mentioned the cauda equina, contained within the vertebral canal, still covered by the meninges, below L2. Within that bundle of nerves, there's a central structure called the filum terminale, and it's a connective tissue that anchors the spinal cord in place at the coccyx bone so that it's not just swaying back and forth from the brainstem downwards. This next picture shows you the conus medullaris at the very end of the spinal cord and the filum terminale, which is that dense connective tissue piece of string, so to speak, that anchors the spinal cord, and then the last coccygeal nerves. So the spinal cord is protected by many structures, including the vertebrae and some tissues that exist between the vertebra, the bone, and the meninges that tightly cover the spinal cord. These tissues we refer to as epidural tissues because they are superficial to the dura mater. And the tissues are adipose, which provides cushioning, and blood vessels, of course, because the spinal cord and the tissue surrounding it will need an oxygen supply from the blood and a way to get rid of waste materials. The cerebral spinal fluid is located in the subarachnoid space, so beneath the dura mater and beneath the arachnoid mater. And it's located in the center of the spinal cord, which isn't very visible on this picture. The central canal tube, a hollow tube that CSF is located in, and it's a remnant of the original embryonic neural tube, which is also hollow. So let's just look at those meninges, the central canal, and the subarachnoid space again. So first, the protection of the spinal cord is bone, right? It's bony. It's the vertebrae. Then we have epidural tissues like adipose. The blood vessels aren't drawn in this picture. Then we have the meninges, the three layers: dura mater, superficial, then arachnoid mater, then pia mater. Between the arachnoid mater, which is blue on this picture, and the pia mater, which is pink, is a space called the subarachnoid space, and that contains cerebral spinal fluid. Also on this picture, you can see the remnant of the neural tube called the central canal, which also contains cerebral spinal fluid. And that is continuous with the fourth ventricle up in the brain. You might have heard of sampling cerebral spinal fluid in certain cases, like when somebody's looking for meningitis, if someone's been exposed or infected with a virus that leads to meningitis. And when CSF is sampled, it's usually done by a procedure called a lumbar puncture. And a lumbar puncture uses a needle to innervate, I guess, or puncture the region inferior to the second lumbar vertebra. So in between the fourth and the fifth lumbar, or maybe between the third and the fourth. It's usually done between the fourth and the fifth. And it's done posteriorly, of course, because that gives you the best access to the spinal cord. But at this region, the only thing that's located is the cauda equina here. The only thing that's located here is the cauda equina. So there's no danger in puncturing the spinal cord proper and damaging it. When this needle is inserted, usually these nerves in the cauda equina are, since they're floating in cerebral spinal fluid, just sort of splay apart. They kind of get out of the way, and CSF can be harvested from this location. So they're looking for different markers when they're sampling CSF. They're looking for signs of infection. Maybe there'll be white blood cells. Maybe they'll actually pull bacteria or virally infected cells. They can also find certain markers for cancers and other CNS disorders like MS, multiple sclerosis, because cells that are damaged give off certain proteins, or cancerous cells release certain proteins that might be present in the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, let's look at the tissue now in the spinal cord. It is a cylinder of neural tissue, but there is some variation. There's white matter and gray matter, just like in the brain. So white matter, remember, is due to the presence of myelin, and gray matter is due to the presence of cell bodies. So the white matter in the spinal cord is superficial. It's labeled number 3 on here. And the gray matter is deep. That is the opposite of what we see in the brain. Remember, in the brain, the cortex, the cerebral cortex, was gray. And deeper, we found white matter. So it's reversed or flipped in the spinal cord. You can also orient yourself as far as what's anterior and what's posterior in the spinal cord based on its anatomy. So notice that at the midline of the spinal cord, there's some slits between the right and left halves. On the dorsal side, this is just a shallow, or narrow, I should say, sulcus. So not much of a space exists between right and left. But anteriorly, or in the front, or ventral, you see a pretty wide split called a fissure. At least it's more noticeable. So that's called the anterior median fissure. There's a couple of other ways that you can tell what's dorsal and what's ventral, or if you prefer, posterior versus anterior. And that's by the shape of the gray matter. The gray matter on the posterior side extends all the way to the edge, to the pia mater. But that is not true anteriorly. Anteriorly, there's white matter located all the way to the edge. So that gives you another clue. You can also look at the nerve roots that emanate from the spinal cord, because there's always a bulge in one of the nerve roots. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's always on the posterior side. If we were to look at white matter and gray matter in the spinal cord under the microscope, this is what we would see. We would see cell bodies of neurons located in the gray matter, particularly here, because I know this is anterior. And so this is where motor neurons are going to be sending out axons. And then the white matter appears lighter because of the presence of myelin. And you can see a few fibers running that have been stained, but for the most part, you're seeing axons that have been transected because the axons are traveling superior to inferior. But then when they are cut, you just see a circle, right? You just kind of see like this. So that's white matter, and it's peripheral or superficial. Now the regions of white matter and gray matter in the spinal cord are divided up, subdivided into subregions. So let's talk about white matter first. White matter is subdivided into columns, and that reflects the fact that information is traveling superior or inferior, up and down. So there's one set of columns or paired columns called the posterior column, right or left. And then the lateral column is right or left. And then there's an anterior column of white matter. Now gray matter is subdivided as well into different regions, but these are not called columns, they're called horns. So the narrow one that's dorsal is called the dorsal horn, and then there's a little bulge out here that's called the lateral horn, and then there's a bulge that comes anteriorly, and that's usually called the ventral horn instead of anterior and posterior. Let's look at spinal nerves a little bit before we examine those gray matter horns in more detail. So a spinal nerve, labeled here, is actually carrying both sensory information coming in to the spinal cord and motor information that's leaving the spinal cord. So a spinal nerve has many neurons, and sensory and motor is separated. The spinal nerve is composed of two roots, the ventral root and the dorsal root. The ventral root is what carries the motor information, and the dorsal root is what carries the sensory information. The sensory information coming in to the spinal cord in a dorsal root then is divided up into tinier bundles, smaller bundles, and these little bundles are called dorsal rootlets. We also see rootlets emerging from the spinal cord on the ventral surface, carrying motor information away from the spinal cord. These rootlets then merge together to form the ventral root, which will become part of the spinal nerve. So I already alluded to the fact that sensory and motor are divided or partitioned, if you prefer, between the dorsal side and the ventral side of the spinal cord. So sensory information comes in dorsally. So sensory is going to come in dorsally. And motor information is going to leave ventrally. So therefore, we have sensory neurons coming from a spinal nerve into this dorsal root and rootlets into the gray matter. Now the gray matter that's there is actually due to the cell bodies of not a sensory neuron, but the cell bodies of an interneuron. And I'm going to go over that one more time, or a couple more times, but that's why it appears gray, not due to the sensory neurons, but due to the presence of interneurons. But the ventral horn and the lateral horn has cell bodies that are motor neuron cell bodies. So these motor neuron cell bodies send out the axons ventrally through a ventral root and then out to the spinal cord. So let's look at these sensory neurons a little bit so that we can understand a little bit more about their parts and where they're located. So imagine you have a receptor out in the skin somewhere that responds to like a pinprick of some sort. Okay, so some kind of a sharp tack or something. That sensory information is going to come in by way of a sensory neuron. But it's traveling in a dendrite. And that dendrite is usually quite long, and it's in the spinal nerve, and then the impulse reaches this dorsal root ganglion. That's the bulge. It's a ganglion. And that's where sensory neuron cell bodies are located. Then the sensory impulse travels along sensory neuron axons to the spinal cord. And those sensory neurons then synapse on interneurons. Motor neurons, it's a little bit different. Motor neurons, as I mentioned, the cell bodies are in the spinal cord, not in a ganglion outside the spinal cord, but the axons are traveling out this ventral root and to the spinal cord. Spinal nerve, sorry. So this slide summarizes what I was just talking about a little bit. The dorsal horn of the gray matter contains the cell bodies of interneurons. And what's coming in here is sensory information. That's supposed to be an S. Sorry. Doesn't look like an S. But the ventral and lateral horns have cell bodies of motor neurons. And there's further subdivision. The lateral horn tends to carry or tends to have neurons that are going to control smooth muscle and glands. So we call them visceral motor neurons. Whereas the ventral horn has motor neurons that will be controlling skeletal muscle. So we call those somatic motor neurons. Okay, let's look at the organization of white matter a little bit. As you know, the white matter is subdivided into columns, and information or neural impulses are traveling superior and inferior in these white matter columns. The columns are subdivided into tracts. So for example, this posterior column that's circled red is subdivided into different regions called tracts. And different tracts are organized based on information that is grouped by what direction the information is traveling or the neural impulse is traveling. So for example, a tract would carry all ascending information going superiorly, or a tract might carry all descending information originating from the brain, going down to the spinal cord, and eventually to a nerve. The tracts of axons in the white matter are also organized based on where the information is going. Like for ascending, what part of the brain? For descending, what muscle? And therefore, also it's organized by default by whether or not the information is sensory or motor. Because ascending information we would classify as sensory, and descending information we would classify as motor. Let's look at the posterior columns, or the posterior column, which is subdivided into tracts. But here we've got the posterior column labeled, and it will only have tracts that are carrying sensory information up to the brain. So we call them ascending tracts. The lateral column, labeled number 2 and outlined in black, has different tracts that are ascending or descending. So there's both. Of course, an ascending tract is going to go carry impulses upwards. A descending tract will be carrying impulses downward. The ascending tracts tend to go to the cerebellum from the lateral column, and the descending tracts tend to go to skeletal muscles. The anterior column has both ascending and descending tracts as well. So specifically, these tracts do have names. You aren't really responsible for knowing the different names. They're not in your study guide question, but I thought you might be interested in understanding an example of how information is organized in the white matter. So we know that the posterior column here, labeled turquoise, only carries ascending information, right? But there's two different types of tracts here, subdivided, and one each is called a fasciculus. The gracile fasciculus tends to carry pain, and it carries some sensory information that's deep touch. The cuneate fasciculus carries light touch, light pressure, and kind of positional information, where your limbs are in space. So that's two different tracts of information going up to the cerebrum. Now let's look at an example of descending tracts. So now we're in the lateral column, which has both sensory, labeled blue, and motor, labeled red. One example of a tract in the lateral column that's carrying descending information is the Spinothalamic Tract. The Spinothalamic Tract carries pain and temperature information. So that's kind of interesting. Oh, that's not motor, that's sensory. Sorry, that's sensory. Okay, let's do some review questions. So, gray matter in the spinal cord, why does it appear darker? Is it due to the presence of motor neurons versus sensory neurons? Is it due to, because one looks dark and one looks light? Is it due to the presence of axons or the presence of cell bodies? And of course, the answer is C, the presence of neuron cell bodies. And then number 2 asks, white matter in the spinal cord, why does it appear lighter? Why is it white? Is it because this is where dendrites are located? Is it because this is where myelin is located? Or is it because this is where axons are located? And you know that myelin is found on axons, so it must be both B and C, and that's true. So it's D. Okay, and here's an exercise that I'd like you to go through. Come on. Question number 3. It's a good way to review what you need to know about the spinal cord anatomically. So I've asked you to use this picture to label the 3 horns, the 3 different columns, the dorsal rootlets, the dorsal root, the ventral rootlets, and the ventral root. And then remember, the dorsal root has this bulge, and that's called the dorsal root ganglion that contains sensory neuron cell bodies. And then I've asked you to identify where the spinal nerve is located. And of course, that's going to be out here, and it's kind of cut off. So when you get done labeling it, there is an answer key on the next slide so that you can check to see if you labeled it correctly. And then I have another review question I think that will help you understand the parts of the neurons and where they're located in the different roots, rootlets, and spinal nerves. So I've asked you to name the type of neuron, and we're talking, is it a sensory neuron, a motor neuron, it's supposed to be an M, or an interneuron? Okay, motor neuron. And also you should label the specific part of the neuron. So coming in, this is all sensory neuron. A is a dendrite. B is a sensory neuron cell body. And C is a sensory neuron axon. D and E are parts of an interneuron, the cell body and the axon. And F and G are parts of a motor neuron. The cell body is F and G is the axon. And if you didn't catch all that, the next slide has an answer key. Thank you very much. That's all for the spinal cord anatomy.